The hardest thing I've ever had to do was actually admit to myself I was trans. The next hardest thing that I had to do was tell my wife about it. Trans people are just ordinary people who want to be happy. That's all it is. We just want to be happy.
You are listening to She Has No Limits, the podcast.
Once you're shown, you can't unsee. Time is short, you best believe in yourself. You're a formidable force driving, diving lessons in the deep end.
She Has No Limits is a movement and community for professional women to come together, be inspired and learn how to design the limitless careers that we deserve. Katie Neeves is a woman on a mission, but she's not just any woman and hers is not just any mission. Katie lived for 48 years as a man while struggling with her gender and hiding her big secret to the world. She was thrown into turmoil when her gender dysphoria increased dramatically, causing her to go on a voyage of discovery before finally admitting to herself that she needed to change her body. She then came out very publicly via a coming out video which she posted on social media and sent to all the clients of her photography and video business, risking her livelihood and reputation in the process. Katie formed Cool to be Trans to support and inspire other trans people and also to educate everyone else on trans issues by showing them that trans people are just ordinary people who want to be happy, just like everyone else. She now helps organisations with diversity and inclusion by providing trans awareness training in an entertaining way by using humour to break down barriers. Katie, a very warm welcome to She Has No Limits, the podcast.
Katie, a huge warm welcome to She Has No Limits, the podcast.
Thanks very much, Amanda. It's great to be here.
So we've given our listeners the formal intro, but I wanted to ask you, where would you like to start your story?
Well, I think really I've got to go right back to birth, to be honest. So I was born 52 years ago, and as is still the established custom, I was assigned a sex based purely on my physical sex characteristics. I was assigned male at birth, and I was given the name Martin Albert Neeves. So that was me labelled. However, at the age of around 3 or 4, my head and my heart were telling me something very different to the label that I'd been given. And one of my earliest memories was at the age of around 3 or 4, was my mum catching me trying on a pair of my sister's knickers. And when I did it, it felt so right. I felt right. But then my mum caught me and she told me off. She told me to take them off. And every day of the following week, she would pull my shorts down and check to make sure I was wearing my own pants. And it was humiliating. I don't blame her. It was the early 70s. It's just how things were in those days, yeah? But it was humiliating, but it sowed the seeds for a very long time that what I was doing was wrong. It was dirty. It was naughty. It was not what respectable people did. But the thing is, however much my mum told me off about it, the need and the urge would always be with me. And so throughout my childhood, I used to secretly dress in my sister's clothes whenever I had the opportunity. And whenever I did it, it felt so right. But then those feelings of feeling right were very quickly taken over by feelings of guilt and shame and self-loathing. And it was many years before I would admit to myself that then I was a cross-dresser. I was just in self-denial, pure and simple self-denial for many years. And so every time I did it, I would promise myself that I would never do it again because this is not me. It's not what respectable people did. And so I'd really try so hard to not do it. But the trouble is, however hard I tried to suppress that need, it would always come back, and usually with a vengeance. So this vicious cycle went right up until my mid-20s. So by my mid-20s, I trained to become a press photographer. And I was working initially on newspapers in Kent before leaving there and moving up to the Midlands, which is where I am now. So I got a job as a staff photographer with the Coventry Evening Telegraph. And that went really well. I was there for about 5 years before leaving to set up my own freelance photography and video business, which I called Martin Neeves Photography and Film. See the issue it caused me later on. So if anybody's starting up a business, don't call it after your name, particularly if you're trans. So anyway, so I did that. So by my mid-20s, I got married for the first time and I got a successful business. And my first marriage lasted for 13 years. And during that time, my pictures were regularly published in national newspapers and magazines. And I photographed many notable people and events, such as the 1990 poll tax riots in Trafalgar Square, Princess Diana's funeral, the Yugoslav civil war in Croatia, and twice commissioned to photograph the Queen inside Buckingham Palace. So, I'd really built up a great reputation for myself. But it was only in my mid-20s that I finally accepted and embraced the fact that then I was a cross-dresser. And as soon as I admitted it to myself and embraced it, it was like a whole weight lifting off my shoulders. I no longer felt guilty about it. It felt great. And I realised that I had a condition called gender dysphoria. And what that is, it's a great feeling of unease caused by a mismatch between how I felt in my head and my heart, i.e. my gender identity, as opposed to my physical sex characteristics and the label that I've been given at birth. And the thing about gender dysphoria is that it can vary in intensity and it very often increases over time. And that's exactly what happened with me, and I wasn't expecting it at all. But at the time, my gender dysphoria was at a low enough level that it was satisfied by my occasional cross-dressing. So at the time, I was happy as a man who needed to cross-dress, and that was all it was. So I thought. I never in a million years thought that I would eventually need to transition. I really didn't. So anyway, so my first marriage lasted for 13 years, although we should have split sooner because my first wife never accepted my cross-dressing. And we tried lots of counselling and it sort of papered over the cracks, but it never really sorted the problem. But there was another big issue in that I wanted kids and she didn't. And I always thought that she might change her mind as she got older, but sadly she didn't. And as I got older, it became more important to me. So as I was approaching 40, the urge to be a dad was getting really strong. And so I just thought these two big things going against us. And it was a shame because we loved each other and we were a good team together, but there's these two massive things that we just couldn't get past. And so I instigated the first divorce. And while I was going through my first divorce, I then went on to meet a woman who would eventually become my second wife. And I decided to tell her about my cross-dressing on our second date. Thought the first date was probably pushing it. Yes. Hello, do you come here often? Oh, look, we've got matching knickers. Doesn't really work, does it? Wouldn't see it if it does. Yeah, so I sort of told her about that. And to my surprise and to my delight, she was okay with it. But there were conditions attached. So she said, as long as I didn't do it more than once a week. But in those days, I didn't, because my level of gender dysphoria was low enough that cross-dressing once a week was okay. So that was all right. So that was a tick in the box. That was fine. And then she said, as long as you never want to transition. Well, I categorically didn't want to transition. I was happy as a man who needed to cross-dress. So I thought. So that was another tick in the box. So that was fine. And the other one she said, which I didn't really agree to, she said if ever we did have kids, she didn't want them seeing it. And I thought, well, I'd already lived a lie with my first wife and I didn't really want any secrets within the family. So I thought, well, any kids that we've got, I'd want them to know the real me. And I wouldn't want some big reveal at aged 18 or however old they were deemed to be, told about it. But I thought, well, let's face it, I'm fishing from a smaller pond here, aren't I? So I thought, well, 2 out of 3 isn't bad. Let's go with it and see what happens. So our relationship blossomed, and 10 years ago, we had a beautiful baby daughter who was the centre of my universe. But it was many years before we got married because after the pain and the cost of the first divorce, I always said I'd never get married again. But eventually I weakened and proposed and we got married in August 2017. However, a few months before we got married, I just happened to meet a clairvoyant and spiritual guide at a business networking meeting. Now, I don't know if either of you have been to any business networking meetings, but you tend not to meet people like clairvoyants at those. Yeah. You meet lots of accountants and financial advisors and people like that. Nothing wrong with those people at all.
I was thinking this is the kind of networking event I need to go to.
Absolutely, yeah. But you tend not to meet those sort of people. And so she was fascinating. So I was talking to her for most of the evening. We got on really well. And I was so intrigued by her that I decided to book up for a reading. Now, I didn't feel the need for a reading or anything, but I was just intrigued. So I went along, and I tell you, she blew me away. She was incredible. She said so many things that were so true, pinpoint accurate, that she couldn't have found out from my website or from my social media or anything like that. And she couldn't have guessed it. But then there were other things that she said which just didn't make sense at the time. Now, they make perfect sense now, but they just didn't at the time. She said things like, there's a new way of being, and there's an issue that you've always known about, but that you're not fully in integrity with. And she said, I want you to go off for a long walk in the countryside, talk to yourself, talk to nature, and talk to spirit, and they will show you what you need to see. So I thought, okay, well, I like walking. What the hell? But I was really busy at the time because I was busy with my work and it was the run up to our wedding. So there was loads of stuff going on. So in the meantime, we got married in August 2017. And it wasn't until very early November 2017 that I finally found the time to take myself off for a long walk. And I went over to Rutland Water because I love it over there. Beautiful part of the country. And I worked out this really long route around the southern part of the countryside and then came back along the southern shore. And I remember it now. It was a beautiful day. It was a blue sky. The sun was shining, not a cloud in the sky. It was a very cold, crisp, clear day. And I went off with my map and my compass and my walking boots, and I was on a mission. I really was. I was striding out and I was talking at the top of my voice, talking to myself, talking to nature, talking to spirit, whoever they were. And I remember feeling disappointed at the time because I was naively expecting some sort of light bulb moment or some sort of voice to say, this is what you should be seeing. Strangely, that didn't happen. I can't imagine why. I thought, oh, perhaps I've done it wrong. Perhaps I should have just sat serenely by the water's edge looking out at the reservoir. But strangely, whether it was coincidence or not, I really don't know, but it happened around about the same sort of time. My gender dysphoria increased dramatically. It went through the roof. So much so that I just didn't know what gender I was at all. And I was in so much turmoil about it that I was even typing into Google, what gender is Martin Neeves? Now, I know that's crazy because the answer could only come from me. It couldn't come from anywhere else, particularly Google. But I was desperate. And it's what desperate people do. Things I couldn't tell my wife about my inner turmoil because I didn't want to stir up a hornet's nest unnecessarily if it turned out to be something or nothing. But also, if I did tell her, it would lead to her asking me questions which at the time I just didn't have the answers to. I didn't know what gender I was. So I just had to work it out myself. So the first thing I decided to do was to get some counselling. And I found a counsellor who had experience of dealing with people with gender issues. And I had 4 sessions with her. And in hindsight, I think I should have had more sessions because at the end of those sessions, I wrongly concluded that I was gender fluid. Now, I'll explain what that is. We're all brought up to think of sex and gender being the same things, but they're not. Sex is about your physical sex characteristics, i.e. what's between your legs, whereas gender is about what's between your ears. It's what's in your head and your heart, how you feel as a person. You don't need to look at your genitals to know who you are as a person and your gender. And for 99% of the population, they're very lucky in that the two coincide. And to those people, I say, well, lucky them. But for about 1% of the population, there's a mismatch, and that causes a lot of unease and a lot of angst and a lot of distress, and that's called gender dysphoria. But let's look at sex to begin with. So sex, basically when a baby's born, the doctor or midwife looks between the legs of the baby and they're given this binary choice to put on the birth certificate either boy or girl. That's all they can put in this country. In other countries, it's starting to change, but in this country, that's all they can put, boy or girl. Well, the thing is that sex itself isn't binary. There are a lot of people who've got an extra chromosome, so that's what's called intersex. So for instance, they might have a vagina, but then they might have internal testes. But obviously, those internal testes can't be seen. All that can be seen is the vagina, so they get put down as a girl. But then that's only talking about their sex. That's not talking about the gender. So because nature doesn't do black and white, it does whole spectrums. It's very messy, nature. So that's sex. But then let's look at gender. So just as sex isn't binary, gender isn't binary either. So it's a whole spectrum, and it's not linear either. There are very, very many people who don't have a gender, and they're called agender. But just for simplicity purposes for now, just think of it as linear, and just think of 100% male at one end, 100% female at the other end. There's a whole spectrum in between. Nobody's either end. Nobody's 100% of either. Even the most cisgender people, that's non-trans people, think that they're 100% just because their gender identity matches their sex characteristics, and the label they've been given. So they've had no reason to look at where they are on the spectrum. But nobody's 100%. We're all a mix somewhere. But the people that sit roughly in the middle, they're non-binary, so they don't feel either male or female. For gender fluid people, they're roughly in the middle, but then sometimes they feel male, sometimes they feel female. And all these things are perfectly normal, perfectly natural ways of being a human being. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the human beings, but there's an awful lot wrong with the labelling system that we're forced to adopt and have done for many years. So at the time, I thought that I was gender fluid. And I realise now why I thought that, and it was my fear of admitting to myself that I was trans that was stopping me from, admitting, it was making me hang on to any bit of masculinity that I had. So I realise that now. But I didn't just take that conclusion as read. So at the same time as doing that, I was working through a self-help workbook called You and Your Gender Identity by a gender therapist from the States called Dara Hoffman Fox. It's a brilliant book, a bit like psychotherapy in a book, really. And it's there's a lot of work involved. It took me about 2 months to work my way through it. And by the time I got to about 3/4 of the way through the book, it became obvious that I wasn't gender fluid. I was, in fact, transgender woman. And then by the time I got to the end of that book, that conclusion hadn't changed. So now I had two conclusions, but they were different. So I thought, what can I do now? So I thought, I know, I'll send a text back to the clairvoyant. So I sent this text back, and she sent me a text back. She said, that's funny, I was expecting your text. No, she wasn't. That was just a cheap joke. Sorry, I just couldn't resist it. I just had to reel you in there. You were sitting there, you were all ears, you were hanging on every word, and I couldn't resist it. Sorry. So you won't believe a word I say now. No, but I should point out, she's not just some sort of mystic Meg sitting in a caravan with the crystal ball predicting the lottery numbers. Or, to be honest, with the state of my finances at the moment, that'd be quite handy. So if you know anyone like that, please let me know. But you're far too young to remember Mystic Meg, aren't you?
No, I remember.
Oh, well, fantastic. So she is actually a spiritual healer specialising in clairvoyant healing and a healer member of the National Federation of Spiritual Healers, which is recognised by the NHS. So she's got some credibility about her. Mm-hmm. And she suggested that I go along for what she calls a vision quest session. And what that is it's a 4-hour interactive process. It's a big old process. And she uses techniques such as deep meditation to get you into a really relaxed state and which allows you to get past all your fear and access your inner truth. And so I went along for that session on the 11th of January 2018. It's a date I'll never forget. And during that session, she didn't give me any answers at all. She just asked me a series of questions. It was question after question after question after question. It was relentless. Now, whether she got the questions from spirit or not, I don't know. I haven't got a clue. But she just asked me all these questions, and she allowed all the answers to come from me and from my inner truth. And it was such an emotional session. I cried buckets that day. I really did. And it was at the end of that session that I admitted to myself that I am a transgender woman and that I need to change my body. And that was the point that I really felt female. And I really felt that Martin had stepped back and Katie had taken over. And it felt so right. And it felt then, and it's felt so right ever since. So now I had discovered my true gender identity, after all 3 different approaches. So, what now? What was I going to do with this new piece of information? I had a happy home life and I had a successful business. Could I put all of that in jeopardy just for the sake of this new piece of information? On the other hand, could I go back to living as I was before with this new piece of information eating away at me? I didn't think I could. Because the thing is, once you know your true gender identity, you can't unknow it. That particular genie just wasn't going back in the bottle. And the thing is, I didn't want to be trans. No one does, because it invariably involves a lot of loss, pain and heartache, as well as dealing with prejudice and bigotry along the way. So nobody chooses to be trans. The only choice I had was whether I did anything about it or not, and whether I decided to transition. And the research that I did showed that most trans people who decide to transition after the initial loss, pain and heartache and bumpy journey along the way usually go on to lead happy and contented lives. Whereas a lot of trans people who decide not to transition and to live their lives for other people, sadly, they often end up in a spiral of depression or even worse. And so the urge to live my truth was just so overwhelmingly strong because I was finally at peace with myself. I knew who I was. So I just had...
Can I pause you a second, Katie?
Yeah, so I do wrap it on, don't I?
No, you're brilliant. I love it. But I am noticing in this conversation, I know what a brilliant storyteller you are and how you use your story as well as other tools to teach others. And so far you've given us this wonderfully fascinating and inspiring story. but you've also educated us along the way, and you have preempted so many questions that we might have as less evolved, can I say, less informed people. And so my mind is like, wow, I need time to process this. I'll just have to park that till after this episode. But what you're doing is brilliant. Thank you. That it's so kind of you to do that preemptive educational bit, because I'm guessing that so many of the people who you're asked to teach, whether that's their employer or themselves, can't quite ask those questions.
No, not at all. This is why I think it's a good way of educating people, because people like being told a story, especially if the person who's actually living it is standing there telling it. But if you can educate people within that story, so that's why I like to weave in the education, and that's why I rabbit on quite a lot about the gender dysphoria and the gender spectrum and all stuff. But I think it's important, because if I just said I was gender fluid, most people don't know really what that is, yeah. And gender dysphoria, most people don't either. And there's so much misinformation that's put out there at the moment that I think it's important to actually put it out there and just show people that we're not just some sort of freaks or some sort of aliens. Yeah, we're just ordinary people. Yeah. So
yeah.
Oh, thank you. So,
amazing. So you were at peace.
That's right, yeah. So I finally admitted it to myself. So I just had to face this head on. So the first thing I had to do was to tell my wife about this. And the hardest thing I've ever had to do was actually admit to myself I was trans. The next hardest thing I had to do was to tell my wife about it. And I was so frightened of telling her that it took me a month to pluck up courage to tell her. And I actually wrote her a letter just in case my words didn't come out right, because I was so frightened and so nervous of telling her. In the event my words did come out right, but I gave her the letter at the end anyway, just so she had something to refer to, because it was such a bombshell that I dropped on her and she was in complete shock. It was awful, and I felt terrible for doing it, especially so soon after our wedding as well. I mean, okay, I know we've been together for a long time, but we'd only just got married. So it was awful, and I felt terrible for doing it. And I should point out at this stage that sexuality and gender are completely separate entities, and they're not linked. And so in my case, I've always been attracted to women, and I still am. It's just that the label's changed. So previously I was labelled as a heterosexual man. Now I'm labelled as a lesbian. It feels no different to me at all. It's just the label that I've been given. But obviously for my wife, her label hadn't changed. She was still attracted to men. So there was obviously a problem. There was a mismatch. Again, we tried counselling, but sadly that didn't work. So unfortunately that meant the end of my second marriage. So it was a very short marriage, that one, even though we'd been together for a long time. And then my next dilemma I had was what to do about the name of my photography and video business when I changed my name to Katie, because it was very boldly branded after my old male name. It's called Martin Neeves Photography and Film. And the problem at the time, it had been an established brand for 22 years, and I was and still am ranked second in the UK on Free Index purely from customer reviews. And so, I built up this great reputation and everything. And I just thought, well, if I was to change the name to Katie Neeves Photography and Film, nobody would know who that was, and it would be like starting from scratch. And I just didn't want to do that. And so it was a very conscious business decision to keep the name of the business the same, but in order to do that, I've had to sort of detach myself from that business, even though I'm the only person working in it. So instead of being Martin from Martin Neeves Photography and Film, I would be Katie from Martin Neeves Photography and Film, treat it purely as a brand name. But in order to do that, I'd have to come out very openly, very honestly, and very publicly as being trans, and continue to do that. So it was a big commitment to doing it. And so what I decided to do was to make a coming out video. And on the 26th of April 2018, I decided to make that public. So I sent it to all my clients and I put it on all my social media. Go big or go home. And I remember now my finger nervously hovering over the mouse, knowing that as soon as I make that click, my life would never be the same again. I clicked the mouse and I waited.
Wow.
But then I had to go on a job. But my mind wasn't on the job at all. It was terrible. I took the pictures as quickly as I could, but I couldn't wait to get back to see what was happening on Facebook. I was absolutely petrified, because the thing is that because I wasn't working for a company, I didn't have a long-term contract or anything. So I wasn't protected by any laws or anything, Equality Act 2010 or anything like that, nothing like that. If my clients had an issue with my being trans, then the phone would just stop ringing and I'd lose all my income. And I was absolutely petrified of that. I really was. there was so much riding on this reaction to the one video, my whole livelihood, my reputation, everything. Anyway, when I got back, I needn't have worried because I was inundated with hundreds of messages of support. It was incredible. I mean, I didn't do any work for 3 whole days because I was so busy answering all these lovely messages of support. It was incredible. And as well as having messages of support from friends and from clients, I had lovely messages from other trans people who'd seen it, who said that they'd been struggling with it. And they thanked me for what I'd said because they said it had helped them. And so, yeah, it was amazing. And it went from something that I was absolutely dreading to being one of the most uplifting experiences of my life. You know, it was right up there. It was second only to the birth of my daughter. It really was. It was amazing. So that was me, well and truly outed.
Katie, just because we know you've got an amazing story to tell, there's a question forming in my head as you're talking, which is around identity. And, you know, this amazing journey that you've gone on, and that, you know, if we did step away from sex and we did step away from gender, what is our identity is the question I'm asking myself. And the decisions we're making, it feels like it's a choice, isn't it? You either have to form it around an identity of male or identity of female.
Yeah. I learned how to be a bloke
sort of where I'm coming from in terms of my thinking.
You know, and I was socially conditioned to be a man, and you know, from those formative years, and because that's how it was. It was just boy, girl. That's it, right? It says boy on your birth certificate. That's what you're doing. You know, you're wearing blue. You're wearing trousers. You're doing this. You've got to grow up to be big and strong. You've got to do these things. You've got to take charge.
I wondered about exploring that piece, Katie, around, you know, when we say we feel male, we feel female, what that means from a feeling perspective. And because we anchor it back to the gender rather than necessarily to who we are, isn't it? And so it's just that sadness of being that we can't be a bit of everything.
You know, we're people and we just want to be happy. And I think if we can be happy in our own skin, then I think that's a really good thing. And, you know, certainly happiness does come from accepting who you are and embracing who you are, whatever that is, in whatever form that is. That's you just accepting who you are. If you fight who you are, you'll never be happy.
And I was thinking, you know, you talked about the stat of 1%. So is that for gender dysphoria?
Yes. It's only a guesstimate, to be honest, because nobody can tell. It may well be more. I mean, there have been some people who've estimated up to 5%. And I think it's something that's going to be growing, to be honest, because more and more people are admitting to themselves that they are trans. I think purely because there's more and more gobby trans people like me sticking our heads above the parapet, sort of saying, look, it's okay, really, and educating. And so because there is more in the media now about it, not all good, though, in the media, but because there is more out there, more and more people are feeling able to do it. Whereas obviously when I was a kid growing up in the 70s, that wasn't a thing.
Wasn't a thing. But it also means that continuum that you talk about is much longer, isn't it? You don't have to be at one end or the other. You can move along that continuum.
With gender,
as far as you're comfortable
sex
to move.
And sexuality, it's actually all a lot more fluid than we like to believe. And it's just sort of accepting that and saying, that's okay, that's fine. But it takes quite a lot to be able to do that, because we are brought up with these gender binary norms that this is what you have to be.
I think for me, one of the big insights into this conversation, your work now with Cool to be Trans is about helping anybody and everybody just be happy. And I wonder, you know, we're talking here about a particular type of unhappiness during those gender dysphoria years. So let's say that's 1 to 5% of the population. Well, actually, what percentage of the population are unhappy? And will they ever come out of that phase of self-denial? Will the genie ever come out of the bottle for them? Will they ever get to the stage where they can't unknow it anymore? And for me, your story is peppered with, in my language as a coach, self-development, self-improvement, that you're open-minded, you're looking for answers. You did a lot of research along the way, didn't you?
If I hadn't have gone to that business networking meeting and I hadn't seen that clairvoyant, would I have made this jump? And I don't think I would. I mean, it might have taken many more years of unhappiness and just trying to be somebody who I wasn't. Yeah, I could quite easily have sort of seen myself just chugging along and being not very happy with my lot. So it's quite really fortuitous that I did meet that clairvoyant, and she was really the catalyst for this. And it wasn't as if a clairvoyant had told me I was trans. She didn't. It's funny, when I turned up to see her for that meeting, she said, I do know what the outcome to this is, but I'm not going to tell you because it's really important that you go through this process and work it out for yourself. That is amazing.
She asked some good coaching questions, is what she asked there, I think, wasn't it? She made you think. Katie, this podcast series is all about allies and community and support networks, and I'm intrigued to find out more about your support networks and your allies and people who have absolutely supported you on this incredible journey that you've been on.
Actually, it has given me a lot of support, actually. And I've had several sessions with her since then. So there's been various different points throughout my transition where there's been crisis points and whatever, and I've gone to see her, and she's been absolutely fantastic. I couldn't have actually done it without her, so I've got to give her a lot of credit, to be honest. So there's one, but then I've also got other really close friends who really helped me through it, because there's been some really, really tough times through this, and obviously going through divorce again as well as transition divorce as well. And there's been a lot of heartache there. So yeah, my close friends have been absolutely brilliant. Then I've obviously widened it out, and then other friends, business networks, and just other friends that I've got have been absolutely outstanding. They really have. They've been amazing. It's incredible that, I thought at the time my world was going to collapse by admitting to myself I'm trans, and the opposite's happened. My world has expanded. It's absolutely incredible. My world is just amazing now. It really has. And the fact that I'm talking to you now, you probably wouldn't have been interested in talking to me either. Just a 50-something old photographer. Yes. Yeah. So, and I'm talking to people all over the world doing this, and it's incredible. Yeah, it blows me away, to be honest. And my story was picked up because I started vlogging my whole story and everything. It was picked up initially by the local media and the local radio and newspapers. Then it escalated and went on national radio and television and national newspapers, magazines, and all of a sudden I'd become this trans ambassador, and then I formed a call to be trans. And so I'm on this real mission to do two things. One is to reach out to other trans people just to let them know that it really is okay to be trans, because it is, because so many don't know. They don't know that it's okay. They think that their world's just going to collapse and that's it. So it's just to let them know that it really is okay. And then the other thing is just to reach out to everybody else and just to educate everybody else and just show them that trans people are just ordinary people who want to be happy. And that's all it is. We just want to be happy. and that is the message. I mean, it's a long way of saying it, but that's all it is.
And that first objective of reaching out to other trans people and letting them know that it's okay, and that, if they can take that courageous step as well, that you'll be there for them, as will others. That must be incredibly rewarding.
It's amazing. Because I'm getting reasonably high profile now, I get contacted by a lot of trans people, and often they could be in a state of self-denial, or if they have admitted it to themselves, then they're absolutely frightened, rigid, and they think, oh, that's the end, and it's just by giving them just a little bit of hand-holding through the journey. And it's amazing, and you see them blossom, and then they're living their best lives, and woof, they're away. That's just fantastic. Sometimes they need a lot more help than that, and it can be very stressful. I've helped to prevent a few suicides, because a lot of trans people do attempt suicide, sadly. The stats are horrific, actually. So sometimes it can be very, very stressful, but often it's just a case of just a little bit of hand-holding and then just seeing them blossom. It's fantastic. Very rewarding.
Can we ask you as well about your work with organisations? So we're really interested in the future of work and how we create future workplaces and cultures that enable everyone to feel like they belong, regardless of their difference. So tell us a bit about that work, Katie.
Yeah, well, basically I help companies with diversity and inclusion by doing trans awareness training and inspirational speaking. So I could be speaking at conferences or just going in or just teaching small groups. And the whole thing is to create an inclusive culture, just as you were describing, within organisations, because so often organisations will come to me as a reactive thing. So a member of staff comes out as being trans, and they might tell HR, and then HR, there's this sharp intake of breath is, oh no, run away, what are we going to do? And the first thing they'll do is go and run straight to a lawyer and ask a lawyer, what do we do to stop ourselves being sued? This is what they're interested in. And rather than thinking about the trans person themselves and also their colleagues as well, because it's not just that trans person that's on a journey, all their colleagues are going to be on a journey with them as well. And so often I get shunted in there to give a helping hand and a bit of mentoring to the trans person, but then train the colleagues. I mean, that's okay doing that, but it's much better to be proactive rather than reactive. It's much better to train your workforce and create that inclusive culture. So then it is okay, and it makes it so much easier for people to come out as trans, because it's a really, really big deal coming out of trans, particularly at work. You don't know whether you're going to get bullied, you don't know whether you're going to lose your job, and it's so much harder finding a job as a trans person. 1 in 3 UK employers won't hire trans people. Yeah, it's it's crazy, and I'm surprised that ratio isn't higher, to be honest, because most of my trans friends have struggled to get work. So it's really, really difficult. So there's a lot of stress involved. But if you've actually created that culture and everybody's gone through the training, then that trans person is going to know that actually, no, I will be supported by doing this. And the thing is, it's so much better because your employees are living their best lives. They're going to do their best work for you. Happy people do their best work. There was a survey recently that showed that LGBTQIA plus people are 32% more productive when they're comfortable being out at work. Well, what's not to like about that? Yeah.
I think it's the ignorance of our colleagues, isn't it? But it's also the lack of vocabulary and the lack of ability to talk about it with care and respect. Because, I could talk about me, that there's a fear that I might be coming across as nosy or rude, and that's not my intent, because there's a whole education piece, isn't there, in terms of help us understand what's going on.
Have you got that fear? Have you? Yeah.
Yeah, I could do with some people, because I think, in terms of that social interaction, we don't know each other. So is it for me to ask you a direct question in terms of what gender are you?
Yeah.
Because that's not within what I would call a normal conversation.
Yeah.
So I think it's about familiarity, isn't it, in terms of building relationships, building trust.
Absolutely.
And people to understand that your intent is kind and it's not
the vast majority of people are supportive. Most people don't want to offend anybody, and so like you don't want to offend me, and so you have that fear of I don't want to say anything wrong. And a lot of people are a bit nervous before talking to me because they are worried about putting their foot in it and saying the wrong thing, and I understand it, I get it. But that's okay, because that's where I can help them, because I can educate and just show them, and that's okay. So in my training sessions, I create an atmosphere where you can ask me anything, and I always say that in the Q&A sessions. You can ask me absolutely anything, and if it's a question that may be offensive to trans people, then I'll answer the question, but then I'll just say to it, please don't ask that of other trans people, because they may find it offensive, but don't feel bad for asking it, because it's all about education, and if you don't ask it, you're not going to know, So I think it's really important to answer those sort of questions.
Well, I totally agree with you, Katie. I totally agree. But you can understand, I can understand why there's a skill set to get the conversation going.
Yeah.
There's a skill set to build a safe and trusted platform to talk with respect. And as you say, to very politely say, please don't ask me that question, because that is offensive, where that question is very generative in terms of what we're learning about each other.
I mean, a typical question that gets asked when I come out to somebody as being trans is often the very first question they'll ask me will be about lower surgery or about my genitalia. Well, you wouldn't ask a cisgender, that's a non-trans person, about their genitalia or about operations on first meeting them. I think you need to buy them at least a very large gin and tonic first. You'd need to know them very well. And even then, even if you know someone really well, you usually wouldn't ask them. You'd wait for them to bring up the subject first, and just treat trans people exactly the same way as cisgender people. Wait for them to bring the subject up, because they may well have had a big operation. They might want to tell you about it, so they might be very proud that they've had that done, and and good for them. And let them lead the way on that.
Katie, can I ask you about some of your learnings? So we're all learning to become. You're learning to become a woman. I'm learning to become a better woman. We're all on that learning process, aren't we? What have been the big learnings for you as a woman so far? And can you give us any comparisons with Martin's learnings?
Well, I still haven't got the hang of multitasking yet. that just doesn't happen.
Apparently that's not a thing anyway. It's a myth. So
good.
Yeah, so that one, don't worry about that one.
That's good. I'm pleased about that because I haven't got it. I definitely haven't got it. It's just like social conditioning, really. Obviously, over 48 years, I was socially conditioned to be a man. And I think just allowing myself to be more empathetic and actually allow myself to be in touch with my softer side and where previously I'd had to sort of put up a bit of a barrier because I felt I had to, and I don't have to now, and that's lovely. So I think that's the main thing, really. Yeah.
Do you catch yourself, because of the learned conditioning and the learned behaviours, do you catch yourself sometimes going back to an old behaviour and then thinking, oh, amazing, I don't have to be that or say that or do that anymore?
No, it's just come to me so naturally. It's just the real me. It's just who I am now. Yeah, it just feels so right, to be honest. I mean, since I started living full time as female from the 2nd of September 2018, since then it's felt so right that there hasn't been a single day that I got up in the morning and thought, oh, I'll pretend to be Martin today. Not a single day. And even though, I've got a different name and a different appearance, I'm still exactly the same person on the inside, but far, far happier. I've got the same skills, the same experience, the same sense of integrity, same sense of humour, however warped. Still the same person, but happier. But I also have cravings for chocolate now too, but it's a girl thing. I have to have my emergency chocolate in the fridge.
Yeah, me too. You mentioned your humour. You're incredibly fun-loving, and I know you use your humour as a really powerful tool to help make people feel at ease and to enable them to go on that growth journey. Have you got any fun anecdotes as to when you've had to use humour to perhaps circumnavigate any ugliness?
Not so much. I mean, I use humour to break down barriers because a lot of people that come along for training that just don't get it to begin with, and it just helps to break down those barriers straight away, because when they can see my sense of humour, they instantly see that I'm just an ordinary person and I've still got a sense of humour. That doesn't get taken away from me. So I haven't really needed to break down ugliness, really. I mean, I get a lot of abuse on social media, but social media is very different to real life, and a lot of people don't realise that. If they spend all their time on social media, they tend to think that that's how the general public are, but they're not. Most people are very supportive, but on social media, because of the anonymity these social media platforms give them, they hide behind their fake names and their avatars and everything. But that's a separate thing, really. And yeah, I mean, I do use humour sometimes with that, but I mean, that's a separate thing, really. But I mean, there have been some sort of funny things that have sort of happened along the way. I mean, I'll give an example actually with my daughter actually now my daughter still calls me dad, and I'm quite happy for her to call me dad because I'm not a mum and I don't want to take anything away from her mum, that I don't want to disrespect her. And I'm proud of being her dad and I love her calling me dad. The only problem is it's a gendered term, and so obviously when she calls me dad when we're out, then obviously that instantly outs me. And so I'm trying to get her to the stage where she calls me dad in private, but then Katie in public. She's not quite there. She's nearly there with it. But the only time that I absolutely 100% ban her calling me dad is when we're in the loos. So one time we were in some public loos and there were a couple of women in cubicles either side of me, and my daughter was just outside the door. And I heard this little voice from outside the door saying, "Dad." I thought, oh God, here we go. And then there was a pause and she said, "Katie," and I thought, it's too blooming late now, isn't it? And then the next thing I said, "So are you going to start having periods now then?"
Oh no.
Now is a good time to have this conversation.
So I said in my very highest voice, "No, darling." And then there was a pause. "So why is that then?" "Oh no, just get me out of it." So I said, I'll tell you later, darling." I couldn't wait to get out of there, I'll tell you. It was just, yeah. So yeah, it's got me into a few scrapes. Yeah. Or another time she could be in the middle of a playground, sitting on top of a climbing frame, and she shout out at the top of her voice, "Dad!" and I go tottering along, and all the other kids are looking around. I had one time, and we were took her to a soft play area, obviously before lockdown and everything. I was sitting having a cup of coffee in the cafe area, and she went in to play, and she was playing with these other kids. And it wasn't long before she came out. She said, "Oh, Dad, can you come in and play with me?" So I said, "Yeah, no problem." So I took my shoes off and went in there. And then, of course, then it wasn't long before she started calling me Dad. This little kid, he put his hands on his hips and his head on one side, and he said, "So are you her mum or her dad?" So I said, "I'm her dad. I'm transgender. That's why I look like this." And he said, "Oh." And then it was like bees around a honeypot. They're all around me. And I found myself doing an impromptu trans awareness training session using age-appropriate language in a soft play area. But as soon as I told them, they just said, "Oh, okay." And they carried on playing. And that was it.
Brilliant.
And it just showed you that kids are brilliant. Kids are just so accepting that, they're fine. It's us adults that are screwed up. We're the ones with the hang-ups. Kids are great, And afterwards I thought, I just better just go tell their mums what's happened. So, because it could have gone either way, I suppose. But I told the mums, and they were great. Then, luckily, it was really nice actually. They didn't realise I was trans anyway, which was lovely. So, yeah, it was great. And then we had a really nice conversation. It could have turned ugly, I suppose, if they'd have been anti-trans, but it was fine. But I just had to deal with the situation as it arose. Yeah.
And what an amazing gift you've given your daughter. You've given her blatant permission to be whoever she wants to be, because it's one thing us parents saying to our kids, "You can be whoever you want to be," but then we are clearly trying to be somebody who fits in to some extent to societal norms. I'm sure she's incredibly proud of you, Katie.
Oh, I hope so. I hope so. I'm proud of her, and I've heard her explaining gender dysphoria to other kids, and she's only 10, and I've heard her talk about it. When she was 8, she was telling the other kids about it, and she's far more knowledgeable about it than most adults. She's brilliant. She's just got it, yeah.
Shall we end with some advice? You've been very generous with educating us through your story. I've learnt an incredible amount in this very short space of time, more so than any other guest we've had, so thank you. For our listeners who may be thinking that something's going on for them, for our listeners who are employers, bosses, managers, leaders, what advice would you like to share?
Okay. Well, first of all, for anybody who's struggling with their gender, if they go onto my website, if they go onto the mentoring page of my website, there's lots of links on there. There's lots of information on the website anyway about it, but apart from all the resources on there, there's lots of links on there to support groups and people like that. So there's some really good solid links on there that may well help them. For employers, what I would say is if you haven't trained all your staff in trans awareness, then you need to. I shouldn't have to make a business case for it, but the thing is that if a member of their staff discriminates against a trans member of their staff for whatever reason, then the employer can be liable for it. And there have been several high-profile cases where that has happened. But you shouldn't have to make a business case for it legally. It's the right thing to do. And the thing is that you'll get the most out of your staff as well. You'll have happy staff. They'll be loyal to you. You'll spend less money on recruiting because that's expensive. And you have a lower staff turnover. Happy staff, they'll do their best work for you. So, it really is in your interest to do that. I think staff welfare should be a high priority for employers. And again, if they want to have a look at my website, there's lots of information there as well.
Thank you, Katie. It's been wonderful spending time with you this afternoon.
You're very welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. Absolute pleasure.
It's lovely to see you both. Thank you.
Where do we start, Amanda? Where do we start? That's a very big story that we have been shared with this afternoon.
I think, for me, at the beginning when Katie was telling us her story, I kept thinking, wow, how many other people stay in self-denial. It says everything about her open-mindedness, her open-heartedness, somewhere knowing that she owed it to herself to go on that voyage of discovery. Voyages of discovery don't get much bigger than this, do they?
No. And my thinking as well was that she's gone on a massive voyage of discovery, but that doesn't mean that we've not all got our own voyages of discovery. So that listening to the niggle, listening to the signs, hers was the clairvoyant that asked the question, but how many of us ignore signs and we never ever address it in any shape or form? We don't go on that self-awareness, self-discovery. We don't get on the long walk she took herself off and ask those deep, deep questions and overcome our fears to find our answers. So, yeah, that inner truth. I wrote down, I think she uses the word inner truth that she went looking for.
The other big part for me was, you asked a question around identity, how we self-identify and how that is informed and shaped by society, by our parents, by our educators, etc. These are constructs, aren't they?
It's quite a big question, that, isn't it? That if you took gender and sex out, how we identify it, I don't know, my thinking's not clear on it. I just think it's a very narrow, binary way that we identify as people. There's so much more to us, isn't there, than our gender and our sex. And it seems to be such a big price for people who are questioning their gender. It shouldn't be. You should be able to say, my gender's this way or the other, or indeed none of it. It's fluid.
Less of a reflection, more of a signposting. I just wanted to reiterate Katie's advice and, say that if anybody is listening, if they want us to put them in contact with Katie's clairvoyant, if they want to talk to us, then our door is open. We have a lot to learn from Katie, haven't we?
We certainly do. I suspect we'll be having her back as a guest at some point soon in the future.
That's it for this episode. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much, listeners, for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed. Please send us your feedback. And if you'd like to have a sneaky peek as to who's coming up, then go to shehasnolimits.com and check out our podcast page.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you all again soon. Take care. All the best.